When I first began to hone my gardening craft, I quickly came to realize that healthy plants and good yields come from healthy soil. But soon after, I had a far more important realization, and that is that everything that passes through my hands in one way or another is on a journey to eventually becoming soil. When, where, and how it becomes soil, in large part, is up to me. And this is one of the most important frameworks that I've developed into my craft, because as much as gardening is about growing something to harvest, it's also about stewardship of the land, the environment, and personal resources. So in this video, I want to challenge your assumptions as a home gardener about what is actually possible when it comes to utilizing everything for building healthy soil for your garden, and how you can start to build a closed loop garden that feeds itself this growing season. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Taylor, and I help gardeners explore sustainable and regenerative growing techniques that lead to increased yields over time while reducing waste. And one of the ways that I do that on this channel is by making free resources available to you that help you along the way. So if you'd like to get access to the downloadable PDFs and recipes that I mentioned in this video, you can scan the code on the screen or hit the link in the description. I'm going to start with a brief overview of our goals as closed loop gardeners, and then I want to get into the practical right away so that you can see how a lot of this is actually made possible. And then we'll return to why a lot of it works and why it's important that we be thinking this way. So what is a closed loop garden? Well, in essence, a closed loop garden is a growing space that generates its own fertility on site. And to put that more simply, you could say that it feeds itself. Now, everything that gives something out needs something put into it. And this is pretty obvious to most of us. One of the earliest ways that you might have learned this lesson was with a piggy bank. You put coins and dollar bills into a box and they stay there until you remove the cash to use it, and you'd never expect to open up a recently emptied piggy bank and find it full of more cash. Vehicles are another example of this. They transport you somewhere that you need to go, but they need gasoline or an electrical charge to be able to do that. As obvious as those examples are, what we oftentimes don't intuit is that the same goes for the garden. If you grow a vegetable or a flower and harvest it, you're taking energy from the soil for your enjoyment and consumption. And that energy needs to be replenished. Pretty simple. But how do we actually do that? Well, there are so many ways and so many options to choose from. You can apply chemical fertilizers that contain nutrients. You could apply organic fertilizers that contain organic nutrients. You could apply compost or leaf mold or grass clippings or animal manure all to the soil so that the energy and the nutrients that the plants that you just harvested used get replenished. So the conundrum becomes, if I'm putting materials and fertilizers on my soil, those nutrients and energy used to create them came from somewhere, and that somewhere now faces a deficit. You may not know exactly where that withdrawal was made, but you can know for certain that resources were used to create fertility for your garden. And most likely, if you're watching this video, you've brought in material from elsewhere to start your garden at some point. I've done this plenty, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, in my opinion. The point of this video, though, is to showcase the many ways that would otherwise be classified as waste material can, and perhaps actually should be, treated as potential energy or nutrients for the soil. So we're going to take a look at a few different materials that have the potential to become soil. I said a moment earlier that everything that passes through anyone's hands is in one way or another on a journey to become soil. Now, in the case of a dried leaf that you rake up in your yard, it might become soil in a few years. If we're talking about a styrofoam cup, we're looking at a few hundred years. Both will become soil at some point. So we're going to take the journey metaphor and apply it to some of our different materials, starting with something very simple, a dried leaf. Now, leaves are abundant in most places. The point of this video is to help you use what you have on site. But if you don't have any trees on your property, someone around you probably does. And I personally like to grab a bunch of my neighbor's leaves because I can use them. Now, just put on the soil surface, this leaf will decompose at a certain point and stop looking like a leaf. Microorganisms, largely microscopic animals, bacteria, and fungi will break down the lignin and the fibers in the leaf, and it will crumble, making it further digestible by other microbes who will break it down into smaller and smaller pieces until finally those pieces are raw nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, as well as other essential micronutrients. And yay, those are the things that garden plants like to eat. But for all of this to happen on its own, it will take up to 3 years, which is much longer than I'm personally willing to wait. And so there's a number of ways that we can speed up the process. You can wet down the leaf. You can pile it high with other leaves. You can keep them damp and aerated. You can mix in grass clippings or other nitrogen-rich materials with the leaves. You can mechanically shred them with a lawnmower. You can mechanically shred them with chickens. All of these things will speed up the leaf on its journey to becoming soil. And if you were to combine all of these, science has figured out roughly how to condense that 3-year journey from leaf to soil into 3 weeks. And these techniques are largely applicable to most of what we unfortunately refer to as yard waste, in this country at least. Lawn clippings, weeds, leaves, and plant debris, to name a few. But there are many other materials that pass through your hands whose journey to becoming soil are less intuitive. For example, in the age of 2-day shipping, cardboard boxes. Now you can toss these in the garbage and they'll go to the landfill, or you can feel a little bit better about yourself and recycle these and they get shipped somewhere. But if you're interested in turning them into soil in your garden, there are several uses that I'm going to highlight. First off, you can tear them up into pieces and compost them like you would dried leaves or wood chips. Cardboard has a high carbon content, so it takes a little while to break down into soil, but composting it will speed up that process. You just need to make sure to shred them up a bit. If you happen to be rich, lucky enough to have a cardboard shredder, you can use shredded cardboard in something like a worm bin, which we'll touch on a little bit more in a bit. But one of the best uses for this stuff is as a decomposable weed mat. A weed mat is something that smothers weeds and is often made from plastic material that sits underneath mulch. But with cardboard, you're killing the weeds while feeding the soil biology, as over time, the cardboard will eventually decompose. And we did this in our front yard and a lot of places in our backyard. And because of our pretty dry climate, it took a few years for the cardboard to fully decompose, but it did eventually. And this is one of the most popular techniques of actually starting a no-till garden bed. Put cardboard down, pile up compost on top of it, and plant into the compost. And then over time, the weeds or the lawn beneath the cardboard will expend energy to find sunlight. They'll hit the cardboard, and as long as you've fully smothered the area, they will not be able to find sunlight, and they'll expend their energy and die. What's beautiful about this process is that once they die, they start to decompose in place underneath the cardboard, which also feeds biology, and by the time the cardboard is decomposed, so will many of the weed remnants. So cardboard's journey to becoming soil could be torn and shredded, used in a compost pile and worm bedding, chicken bedding, as a weed mat for a garden bed or a pathway. Now just getting these processes down of using the obvious organic plant-based waste materials to turn into soil is a great step that most gardeners will probably take at some point in their gardening practice. But let's get into some other less intuitive materials. And at a certain level, the main question that we need to be asking with everything that we'd otherwise throw away is, how could this be used to build soil? Or maybe what does this object need in order to be processed to find its way into the soil? So let's take eggshells. Eggshells thrown onto the garden soil whole can take up to 5 years to decompose. Now, crushing it may reduce that timeline a bit. Baking them in the oven and crushing them up will speed up the process a little bit more. But we actually might be missing some opportunities if we just bake, crush, and toss into the compost. A step that I teach on this channel fairly often is to extract calcium from baked and crushed eggshells using vinegar, 1 part shell, 10 parts vinegar for 2 weeks. And then the shell can be strained out and put in the compost pile, and it will actually decompose a lot faster. We're also left with a super easy to make water-soluble calcium product that can be sprayed on plants during fruit production and incorporated into our chicken water to resupply our chickens with the calcium that they use to make the eggshell in the first place. And now we're really getting into something closer to a closed loop setup. Chickens produce eggs, eggs are collected, baked, calcium's extracted, given back to the chickens, eggs further decompose in the soil. And you can totally just give your chickens the eggshells, by the way, too, and they'll peck at them and get the calcium that way. What about something like animal bones? And I'll tell you, I have tried to compost animal bones before, and I ended up just picking them out of the garden whole. So instead, let's take a whole chicken and run it through its journey to becoming soil. If you eat meat and you don't buy chicken whole yet, you really should try it. I look forward to the day that we grow our own meat birds, but for now I rely on the grocery store for my chickens, and buying whole is a great way not only to save money, but consume a bit more responsibly. I'll roast my chickens whole, spatchcock them or break them down and cook them into their individual parts. But whatever way that I'm preparing my bird, I'm going to be left with the carcass or the bones. Now, I could try to compost this carcass, in all likeliness rot and attract rodents and pests and be a nasty mess. Instead, I'm going to add some mechanisms. So I'm going to speed up the process and decompose it a little bit more effectively. So starting with the most obvious, I'm going to roast up the bones and make chicken broth. I'm also going to add veggie peels that I've collected throughout the week, by the way. I've got some mushroom bottoms, some carrot peels, onions, and garlic skins, and these are going to flavor the broth. Once that's happened, I've extracted a good amount of collagen and some minerals that my family gets to consume, and then I'm left with some more kind of crumbly chicken bones. Now at this point I have some options. For broth leftovers, I like to send these to my bokashi bin once they've cooled down, and bokashi is a lot less intimidating than it sounds. If you've been waiting to start a bokashi bin, maybe this should be your year. This is a process of pre-fermenting food scraps and plant material, meat, dairy, cooked foods. Everything can go in here for the purpose of even and safe decomposition in the soil or in a compost pile. All you need for this is a bucket and a microbial inoculant. You can buy a bokashi brand. We've got tutorials on how to make your own. You can use lactic acid bacteria. You can probably honestly use kefir or yogurt whey. You could use your IMO 3 or 4 if you've got it. Whatever you want to use, you got to just coat your food scraps in the microbial inoculant, press them down in the bucket, seal it up, and collect the juice once in a while. And this food scrap leachate, by the way, can go on the compost pile or in the soil where there's no plants in the ground. And then once your food scraps have fermented for a few weeks, you can compost them right alongside your dried leaves, grass clippings, crop residue, everything else. Using this technique, I've been making soil out of meat scraps, dairy, and other food waste for years. Now back to the chicken bones. These will undergo a microbial decomposition process in the bokashi bin, but I found that if I can crush them up a bit beforehand, that gives them the best chance at fully decomposing in the compost pile. But let's say that they're too big to crumble, or maybe I've got some beef or pork bones that I've already made bone broth out of, and I don't want to toss them. For these, we're going to take another detour. So first stop, we can do the same vinegar extraction as we did for our eggshells. This one is going to contain a bit more phosphorus compared to the eggshells, but still a good amount of calcium. And then just make sure to scrape off all of the fat and cartilage from the bones before doing the vinegar soak, because those can throw off the concoction and the fats can mold and get nasty. And then after the vinegar extraction, the bones are going to be more easily crushable. So you could do that and mix them into your bokashi bin. But there's another mechanism that I really like to employ at this stage, and for that we have to go outside. An in-ground cone-shaped fire pit is an amazing tool that we can utilize when it comes to converting bones, not to mention wood debris, into valuable soil. And the way we do it here creates very little smoke and requires very little equipment. It just requires you to be safe and smart and have water buckets nearby ready to douse the flames. The reason that we're using fire here is because with this approach called the Kontiki method, we're going to get a really, really hot burn going. So hot, in fact, that once this gets rocking, all the volatile gases that get emitted from the wood and the bones are going to be vaporized, and thus smoke will be drastically reduced. This is kind to our neighbors and a great way to easily turn material into charcoal that can be used in our gardens. And we'll be coming out with a video this winter solely devoted to this approach. The point is that this is a great way to create something called biochar from bones and of course other wood material that you have on site. And biochar, in case you're not familiar, is just a pure source of carbon material crushed down a bit and filled with nutrients and microbes that is then applied to the soil. Now, if you don't want to burn, maybe you're not allowed to, or you don't believe in the efficacy of biochar, we've got some other options for our bones and wood. And this is the way that we use these materials, and that way is simply by burying them. Wood takes a very long time to decompose fully, far longer than leaves, but with the hugelkultur technique, we can actually take advantage of this and get some real usage out of them. And bones can go down there as well, so long as they're clean. For this technique, we're really looking at ways to get healthy fungal cultures established, which are doing most of the decomposition when it comes to woody material. So to start, dig out a section of the ground that you want to create a hugelkultur mound. And then once the soil is removed, put your logs and bones down at the bottom of the hole. You can also put all the stuff that you put in a compost pile. You can put in bokashi food scraps here, grass clippings, crop debris, leaves, cardboard, whatever you want. And then pile the soil back on top. And the crucial thing here is that we give it a few feet distance from the logs to where we're going to be planting. So you really need to dig deep or pile up more topsoil or compost on top. Otherwise, the nitrogen in the soil where your plants are going to be trying to grow is going to be immobilized, and your plants won't have what they need to be able to grow. But after a few years after installing one of these mounds, the fungal mycelial networks are going to have infused the garden bed, and nitrogen actually becomes much more mobile than it was before in the same soil. And the reason that this works is because wood logs have a small surface area, especially when compared to wood chips, for example, which means that the microbial access is limited to just the outer perimeter where the decomposers are going to utilize the nitrogen, specifically ammonium that's localized in the soil that comes into contact with the logs. And so nitrogen is temporarily immobilized in the first few weeks and months, but then actually reverses as the fungi mineralize organic material in the soil. And we'll touch on this a tiny bit later on. Point is, don't throw away your logs and branches if you've got them. There are plenty of uses for them in the garden, especially when we're creating a closed loop system. Now, so far, we've just looked at ways that we can utilize waste streams and the various mechanisms that we can treat materials with in order to speed up their journey to becoming soil. But I want to look at some other ways that we can create fertility and utilize the fertility that's already present in our gardens to further close the loops. One of the self-given tasks of non-invasive weeds in our yards is to remineralize the soil. Dandelions, for instance, send long taproots in search of calcium at lower layers of the soil that they can then transport up into their above ground biomass and then re-impart to the upper layers of the soil. But dandelions, at least in my part of the country, are largely considered unfavorable because they spread like wildfire and are hard to remove. But the lesson taught by dandelions is still valuable. And one of the ways that I like to apply this lesson is by planting other plants that act similarly, but that either don't spread as rapidly or are easier to remove. Borage, yarrow, and comfrey are three of my favorite functional or strictly beneficial plants that I like to include in my gardens. What each of these are doing at some level is helping to unlock and make accessible nutrients found in the soil that would otherwise be out of reach. Borage and comfrey send deep taproots into the subsoil where roots collaborate with microorganisms to chelate insoluble minerals such as potassium and phosphorus and many others, solubilizing them and further partnering with mycorrhizal fungi to process and transport those nutrients into the plant's leaves. In plain English, this means that nutrients that were previously unavailable to the soil surface are made available when these plants draw them out of the subsoil. Yarrow, on the other hand, extends a fibrous root network closer to the soil surface and is hyper effective at enhancing mineral dissolution. And these minerals get accumulated in its above ground biomass. For all of these plants, their biomass can then be harvested and then redeployed elsewhere in and throughout the garden to distribute the carefully mined nutrients. This is a really cool way of getting more out of your soil than you might have previously thought possible. And there are plenty of similar plants that do similar things. The point is that without plants like this, our soil is sort of like a treasure chest with no key. We've got the riches, but no way to really access them. And plants like comfrey, borage, and yarrow act like keys to that treasure chest. Now, with all of these different materials and various processing mechanisms that we can use to generate and save fertility, I want to briefly talk about compost. And I want to make this both highly practical and also not overly detailed and complicated, because there are different personalities who are going to want to respond to this in various ways. But with all of the materials that we have the ability to process before turning into soil, it should be said that these all can go either directly on top of the soil or dug slightly into your soil in your garden. If you're like me, this can sometimes feel a little cattywampus. Let me break that down. If I'm digging bokashi fermented food waste into my soil here in this garden bed, and then I'm chopping and dropping yarrow over here in this part of the yard, and I'm spreading biochar over in that part of the yard, I start to feel a sense of mild anxiety, similar to what I might feel with a cake that was baked without properly mixing the ingredients together. One bite might taste delicious because the ingredients happened to come together in the way that they were supposed to. But then in the next bite, I might get a mouthful of baking soda. and that would be very unpleasant. So I consider compost as the great unifier and connector and penultimate resting place for all of these nutrients. And the sense that I get is that I'm properly mixing the batter before spreading it out in my cake tin. In other words, composting my bokashi food waste, yarrow trimmings, dried leaves, chicken manure, and charcoal is going to result in something closer to a well-balanced, nutritionally and microbially complete substance that can then be applied to all of my soil. So that's where most of my resources seem to end up. Now, I said we'll get practical here, so here it is. As you're calculating your compost needs, there are really two general numbers that you need to keep in mind when it comes to replenishing the soil nutrient needs after a year of growing plants. And of course, this is a general rule, not a one-size-fits-all standard. Some plants are going to be heavier feeders than others, some less. But generally speaking, an inch or 2.5 centimeters of compost applied to established garden beds once a year should more or less cover your soil needs as far as replenishing what was taken and therefore closing the loop. And if you're growing cover crops and chopping and dropping in place, you might be able to skip that. For brand new garden beds, say that you're using a cardboard weed mat and the compost combo that I talked through earlier, you're gonna need something closer to 6 inches or 15 centimeters of compost. Now let's say that you build a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot hot compost pile, the sort of standard minimum size for a pile to heat up and establish thermophilic microbial cultures. In my experience, that pile is going to shrink quite a bit over the course of a month or two into half of a yard of finished compost, or 13.5 cubic feet. So if that's what you're able to generate, if you're starting from scratch, you could hypothetically cover an approximately 27 square foot growing space of brand new garden bed, 6 inches deep, 13.5 cubic feet, and that gets you 27 square feet of growing space. Or you could cover a 162 square foot growing space of established garden beds with that same amount of compost layered on 1 inch thick. Let's reverse engineer this now. If you want to install a 100 square foot garden bed using compost, you'd multiply 100 square feet by 6 inches, or half a foot, and end up with 50 cubic feet, or 1.85 yards of compost. And let's say on top of that, you wanted to top dress a 100 square foot growing space with 1 inch of compost. That would mean that you would need to make 8.3 cubic feet, or around 1/3 of a yard's worth of compost to cover that space. Add those together, and you're looking at around 2.15 yards of finished compost, meaning that your initial total amount of piled up material would need to be around 4.3 yards worth. If you've got a compost base set up where your bays are 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, that means that you got to fill up 4 of those to accomplish this particular project. Now, some of you are going to be shaking your head saying, I'm getting way too in the weeds. Don't worry about it. This is not for you. The point of doing the math here is not so that I can get an exact amount of compost that I want each season down to the inch. It's so that I can sort of get a starting point and set my expectations. Because the truth is, building soil from scratch is something that's hard to do if you're not bringing in externally sourced materials. Okay, one more time. The purpose of this exercise is less likely so that you can make that exact amount of compost as much as it is to aim you in the right direction. Maybe you've got huge ambitions and you don't even realize it. Well, great. Now you understand a little bit more about what you're looking at, and you can start to appreciate what kind of inputs it's going to require for you to get started, and what kind of planning is required for you to set up systems that you can benefit from in the future. All of the techniques that we covered here are long game approaches. And of course, soil building is going to take some time. So this isn't to say that a closed loop garden system where you're growing fertility on site and utilizing all of your waste streams can't start by importing some amount of external resources. What we're trying to figure out is how we can avoid buying in soil every single year. For our farm, I'm in the process of planning how we're going to be able to grow all of our own Korean natural farming inputs that we use to build soil. I'm looking into how much barley, for instance, that I would have to grow to be able to harvest my own that I can then use to collect indigenous microorganisms with, rather than having to buy barley from the store every time. I'm looking into ways that I can grow the herbs that I need to make my own Oriental herbal nutrient extract. The main thing that I'm trying to figure out is how I'm going to be able to grow and make my own sugar that's used in a lot of the natural farming inputs that I currently make. All these things are in the works. I'm also planning and looking into the space needed to grow my own chicken feed. Point is, I'm trying to take steps closer each year to to becoming a closed loop growing operation. I don't expect it to all happen at once, and you probably shouldn't either. But now that we've covered a few of the many practical implications in utilizing waste streams and growing fertility on site, along with the various mechanisms that we can use to do that, I want to talk a bit about the why. As I've already alluded to, all soil, with few exceptions, contains nutrients in the form of organic matter and/or mineral particles. And these are largely, if not entirely, what we refer to as insoluble nutrients, meaning the nutrients contained in a dried leaf or a rock, for example, won't wash away when water flows through them. The nutrients in all of those materials also can't be absorbed by plant roots, because water is the mechanism by which plants uptake nutrients into their bodies. They don't have teeth and digestive tracts like animals. They rely on other ways of receiving those nutrients. And microorganisms are the primary factor when it comes to preparing and delivering water-soluble nutrients to plants. Microbes digest and break down leaf matter and rocks into soluble nutrients that plants can then uptake. And while we're here, really, microbes are the ones doing that for us as well. Anything from an apple to a piece of chicken to a slice of bread is mechanically crushed by our teeth, and beyond that undergoes a massive amount of enzyme and acid treatment courtesy of the microbial communities in our mouths, guts, and stomachs, so that the insoluble nutrients in the food can be processed and delivered to our bloodstream in the form of water-soluble nutrients. So it's important that we recognize that microbes play a substantial role in the nutrient bioavailability game. In fact, they're the primary vehicle, or as I've been saying, mechanism, when it comes to facilitating a closed loop system. I talked through the bokashi method a bit. Microbes here are being used strategically in bokashi so that food matter can be prepared for thorough and complete decomposition into the soil. Now remember that food waste would become soil eventually, but while it's in my possession, I get to decide when, how, and where it ends up being soil. And the thing that I find so appealing about microbes when it comes to using them to generate soil is that it's really a remarkably sustainable treatment mechanism from an energy and resource perspective. In other words, microbes multiply very quickly on their own. And with certain nudges and strategic planning, we have the ability to get them to multiply even more quickly, which means that these processes that we find in nature can be sustainably sped up without many negative consequences. An animal carcass that would take a year to decompose in the wild could be treated with a specific microorganism so that it decomposes within a matter of months, using microbes from things like lactic acid bacteria, bokashi, hot compost, Jadon microbial solution, indigenous microorganisms, all of which we utilize at some level in our gardening operations, are mechanisms that bring sustainability to our practices and get us better soil faster using less. And hopefully I've highlighted a few other mechanisms that are just as sustainable, such as chickens for shredding materials and adding nitrogen. Worms are an incredible way to process fruit and veggie scraps. Fire is a powerful mechanism that, when used sparingly and in a responsible way, can actually be turned into a fairly sustainable way of processing materials. And again, I'm speaking very idealistically here to make the point. Of course, we're not doing everything perfectly by any stretch, and I don't judge anyone who uses externally sourced materials for improving their garden soil, even year after year. This isn't really an all or nothing sort of thing. But I hope that this video has gotten you to think about and even just start to ask the question, before I throw this thing away, whatever it is, could it be used to build soil in my garden? And as you plan your garden, you might ask, how could I intentionally grow a bit of my own fertility? And I think that this really gets to the heart of all of our practices that Cassidy and I want to live by as well, beyond the garden, which is, how can we be giving back as much as we're taking, if not more? And so hopefully this video got you to ask the same. If you want to start practicing some of these techniques that we talked about, we've got recipes linked in the description that you can download, print out, and use. Let me know in the comments how this pinged your brain or challenged you and what you're going to be practicing this growing season. And if you would like to dive a bit deeper on how to make your own bokashi bran, check out our bokashi deep dive video where I teach you how to make lactic acid bacteria out of a few simple ingredients and use it to ferment your food waste. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.